Joe Walsh has seen things most people will never believe. Not because they are impossible, but because the music industry spent decades making sure they stayed buried. The 1970s rock scene was sold to the world as the greatest party ever thrown. Freedom, rebellion, brotherhood. A generation of fans bought that story completely, and honestly, who could blame them? The music was real. The energy was real. But behind every anthem that made millions of people feel alive, there was a different story unfolding quietly in the shadows. A story about manipulation, about ego so large it swallowed entire careers whole, about people who smiled for cameras and then became completely unrecognizable the moment the lights went down. Joe Walsh lived inside that world for decades. He did not observe it from a safe distance. He was on the stages, in the hotel rooms, and inside the studios where deals were made and people were broken without anyone outside ever knowing. That is what makes his honesty so rare and so uncomfortable. Most people who survived that era kept quiet. Silence was the price of survival, and almost everyone paid it willingly. Joe Walsh eventually stopped paying. What he reveals is not the glamorous chaos the documentaries love to replay. It is something uglier, something that sits in your chest long after the music stops. The 1970s rock world was not just wild. It was deliberately designed to protect certain people at the expense of everyone else. Talent was secondary. Profit was everything. And the human cost of keeping that machine running was staggering, measured not in dollars but in broken people, shattered relationships, and careers quietly strangled before they ever had the chance to breathe. The myths people still carry about that era are comfortable lies. Romantic lies, but lies nonetheless. The reality Joe Walsh witnessed was a system that rewarded cruelty, laughed at vulnerability, and turned genuine suffering into entertainment. The bigger your name, the more you were protected. The smaller your name, the more you were used. That was the unspoken rule everyone understood and almost nobody admitted to out loud. And here is what makes this story impossible to ignore even now. Those same myths are still being sold today. The documentaries still glow. The anniversaries still celebrate. The legends still receive standing ovations while the people they damaged remain nameless and voiceless somewhere in the background of history. Joe Walsh watched all of it happen in real time. And now, finally, he is being brutally honest about everything. The question is whether the world is ready to hear it. The first thing you need to understand about Joe Walsh is that he was never the loudest person in the room. That distinction always belonged to someone else, always belonged to the kind of man who mistook volume for power and arrogance for charisma. Walsh watched those men carefully. He studied them the way you study something dangerous, not out of admiration but out of necessity, because in that world, understanding who held the power and how they used it was the difference between surviving and disappearing. And what he saw over and over again, in band after band, in city after city, was the same pattern repeating itself with depressing consistency. The biggest personalities in 1970s rock were not always the most talented. They were simply the most shameless. They had perfected the art of taking up space, of making every room orbit around them, of ensuring that their comfort always came first regardless of the cost to everyone else. On stage they were electric. Off stage they were exhausting in ways that words barely capture. The kind of exhausting that does not just tire you out but slowly hollows you out, draining something from you that never fully comes back no matter how much time passes. Joe watched musicians he respected get chewed apart by these personalities. Good people. Genuinely talented people who made the mistake of believing the brotherhood was real, who trusted the wrong smiles and signed the wrong agreements and woke up one morning to find that everything they had built was somehow no longer theirs. It happened quietly. That was the thing that always struck Walsh the hardest. There were no dramatic confrontations, no honest conversations, no moments where the truth arrived loudly and clearly. It just happened, slowly and silently, the way rot works inside a wall. By the time you see the damage, it has already been there for years. The public never saw any of this. Why would they? The machine was extraordinarily good at controlling what reached the outside world. Interviews were managed. Stories were shaped. The narrative was always the same. These were larger-than-life figures living larger-than-life adventures, and the chaos was just part of the magic. Nobody talked about the assistant who quit without explanation. Nobody mentioned the opening act that suddenly vanished from the tour. Nobody asked too many questions because asking questions was quietly understood to be a career-ending decision. Joe Walsh understood the game. He played it long enough to know every move. But understanding a game and loving it are entirely different things, and Walsh never loved this part. Not even close. And that difference, quiet as it was, changed everything about how he eventually chose to speak. The managers were the ones Joe Walsh watched most closely. Not the musicians, not the label executives sitting behind mahogany desks in expensive suits, but the managers. The fixers. The people who existed in the space between the artist and the money, who understood that their power came entirely from controlling what information moved in which direction and what never moved at all. They were not creative people. They did not make music or feel music or lose sleep over whether a bridge in the third song was hitting the way it should. What they understood, with absolute precision, was leverage. And in the 1970s rock world, leverage was the only currency that actually mattered. These were not villains in the way movies portray villains. They did not twirl mustaches or deliver monologues about their intentions. They were charming. Extraordinarily charming. The kind of charming that makes you feel chosen and makes you feel like you are the one person in the room they have decided to be completely honest with. Artists fell for it constantly because artists are wired to connect, wired to trust feeling over evidence, and these men exploited that instinct with surgical precision every single time. By the time a musician realized what was happening, the contracts were signed, the percentages were locked in, and the exits had been quietly bricked over. Joe Walsh saw careers dismantled by these people. Not in explosive moments of obvious betrayal, but in slow, methodical erosion that was almost impossible to name while it was happening. A bad deal here. A missed opportunity there. A relationship subtly poisoned with a few carefully chosen words dropped into the right conversation at the right moment. None of it looked like sabotage from the inside. It only revealed itself as sabotage years later, when you sat down and traced the timeline honestly and realized that every turning point where things went wrong had the same fingerprints on it. What made it worse was the complicity of the wider industry. Labels knew. Lawyers knew. Other managers knew. The information existed inside a closed circle of people who all benefited from the system staying exactly as it was. Speaking out meant losing access. Losing access meant losing money. And so the silence held, year after year, reinforced not by threats but by self-interest, which is always a far more reliable enforcer than fear alone. Walsh watched good music get buried because the person who made it refused to play alone. He watched mediocre music get pushed to the top because the person behind it understood the rules perfectly. Talent was never the deciding factor. Compliance was. And that brutal truth about the music industry, the one the documentaries never quite managed to say out loud, sat at the very center of everything Joe Walsh eventually decided he could no longer stay quiet about. Addiction was the great equalizer of the 1970s rock world, except it was never really equal at all. That is the part nobody wants to say, honestly, even now, decades later, with the benefit of distance and perspective and everything that has been learned about substance abuse since those years. The story that gets told in retrospectives and anniversary documentaries is the romantic version. The one where excess was freedom and destruction was authenticity, and the musicians who burnt brightest burned fastest, and that was somehow beautiful. Joe Walsh lived the unromantic version. The one with no soft lighting and no carefully selected soundtrack. The one that smelt like hospital rooms and tasted like regret. He watched people he genuinely loved disappear into substances so gradually that there was no single moment you could point to and say that was where we lost them. It happened in increments too small to measure individually but catastrophic when you added them all together. A little more than last time. A little earlier in the day. A little less functional, a little more dependent, a little further from the person they had been before the machine got hold of them and decided their destruction was marketable. Because that is what the industry did with addiction. It did not treat it as a crisis. It treated it as content. The worse someone got, the more fascinating they became to the public. The more fascinating they became, the more records sold, the more tickets moved, the more the label leaned in instead of pulling back. There was no intervention waiting at the end of that road. There was only a calculation, cold and precise, about how much further this could go before the asset became a liability. And the calculation was always made by people who went home to clean houses and healthy families, while the musicians they managed continued to fall apart in hotel rooms across the country. Joe Walsh has spoken about his own battles with honesty that costs something to deliver and something to receive. He does not dress it up. He does not frame it as a wild adventure that somehow worked out fine. He describes it as a slow theft, something that took years from him that he will never recover, years where he was physically present but genuinely gone, performing on stages he cannot fully remember for crowds whose faces blurred into a single indistinct mass. The music continued. The tours continued. The money continued flowing in the right direction. And underneath all of it, a real human being was quietly drowning while everyone around him kept applauding. That is the story the 1970s never told itself honestly. And it is the story Joe Walsh refuses to let disappear quietly into the comfortable mythology that history has been building around that era ever since. There is a particular kind of silence that exists in closed systems. Not the silence of someone choosing not to speak, but the silence that comes from understanding, deeply and completely, that speaking will cost you everything. Joe Walsh has described this silence as the real architecture of the 1970s music industry. Not the contracts or the corporate structures or the management hierarchies that existed on paper. Those were just the visible scaffolding. The real architecture was built from fear and complicity and the quiet agreement that certain truths would remain unspoken because speaking them would collapse the entire edifice everyone had built their lives around. Victims came forward sometimes. Not often, but sometimes. Women mostly, though not exclusively. People who had been used in ways that violated every basic principle of human dignity, who had been promised opportunities and received exploitation instead, who had been told to stay quiet because making noise would damage careers more valuable than theirs. And what happened to them when they broke the silence was instructive. It was meant to be instructive. It was a message sent not just to them but to everyone watching, everyone considering whether they should say something, whether they should let anyone know what had actually happened behind closed doors. The message was simple. Stay quiet, and you survive. Speak and you disappear. Not dramatically, not in ways that would leave marks obvious enough to investigate, but quietly. Your name stops appearing in conversations. Your calls stop getting returned. Opportunities that were promised evaporate without explanation. You become someone who was briefly there and then was not there anymore, and nobody new comes along asking what happened to you because asking questions like that is how you become someone who was briefly there too. Joe Walsh watched this mechanism operate over and over. He watched it work. He watched people internalize the lesson and make the calculation and decide that survival was worth the price of silence. And he also watched the machinery use this calculation as proof of normalcy. If nobody was talking about it, that must mean it was not really happening, or if it was happening, it was not really that bad, or if it was that bad, then it must have been deserved somehow. It must have been the price of admission to a world where the rules were simply different than they were everywhere else. What makes Joe Walsh different, what eventually made him willing to break his own silence, was recognizing that the machinery was counting on people like him to stay quiet forever. It was counting on the fact that most people who witnessed the damage would decide that the cost of speaking was simply too high. And at some point, he decided that the cost of continuing to stay quiet had become even higher than the cost of finally telling the truth.